the people who love his moral corruption, who love his disgusting attitudes and behaviours, to defend his latest conduct. Because I don't know today, let's start where we ended last year, I don't know who has rendered themselves more ridiculous.
This isn't about left or right. This is about how far people will bend reality to defend power even when the facts are staring them in the face. Watch how this unravels, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. If this kind of honesty matters to you, like the video and subscribe, because what comes next is exactly why people get uncomfortable.
Yuval Noah Harari wrote, and I read this to you at the time, in April of last year, about Donald Trump creating a world of rival fortresses. The surprising thing about Donald Trump's policies, he wrote, is that people are still surprised by them. Headlines express shock and disbelief whenever Trump assaults another pillar of the global liberal order. At the time, the best example was his support for Russia's claims for Ukrainian territory, or his contemplation of the forced annexation of Greenland, or the unleashing of financial chaos with his tariff announcements. And you have to sort of recognise that there is nothing surprising anymore about what he does. And sadly, there is nothing surprising about the desperate contortions undertaken by the people who love his moral corruption, who love his disgusting attitudes and behaviours, to defend his latest conduct. Because I don't know today, let's start where we ended last year, I don't know who has rendered themselves more ridiculous in their attempts to defend Donald Trump. It is either Nigel Farage, who you probably have heard of, or a chap called Richard Littlejohn, who writes columns in the Daily Mail. They have scaled, frankly, extraordinary heights of absurdity in their inability to criticise.
Watch this carefully. This isn't Trump speaking. This is what blind loyalty does to people. When defending power matters more than truth, dignity disappears first.
Venezuela, effectively. Mario Puzo. All right, probably the least obvious character on this list. Mario Puzo, as you probably know, is the author of The Godfather. I watched the first two, the only two, really, Godfather films over the holiday period, and was reminded of two things, both of which came into very sharp focus when Donald Trump illegally invaded Venezuela. The first was, and kidnapped the president. The first was, do you know, I nearly said then, no one's going to mourn much for the passing of Maduro's political career, but you don't do that. That way madness lies. You are not allowed to invade foreign countries and kidnap the president. It doesn't matter how awful he is. It doesn't matter whether or not he tortures kittens or pulls the wings off butterflies. It does not, none of it matters. You just don't do it any more than you pardon people, just to jump ahead slightly, who are serving 45-year sentences for trafficking cocaine while president of foreign countries. It's just not allowed. So you don't caveat your support for international law by saying, well, this time, the guy they broke international law for, he was a bit of a wrong. That's not how law works, right? You don't, for example, say, well, do you know what? If the police want to kick down someone's door and string him up from the nearest lamppost because they know he's a wrong 'un, even though they haven't been able to prove it in a court of law, then, yeah, that's all right, I'll look the other way. And do you know why this matters? Do I have to explain? Because next time it could be you. That's all. Next time it could be your country that gets illegally invaded because the president says it's the right thing to do, or because they have decided that the leader of your country is a wrong 'un. One newspaper today has Greenland on its front page.
This is the line they never want crossed. Once you excuse this, you excuse everything that comes next.
The possibility of Greenland, European territory, being next. What is it that the leader of Greenland has done that constitutes justification for an epic breach of international law? I'll wait. So the idiots, and I use the word very kindly, the idiots trying to defend what Donald Trump has done are ignoring several things, not least, of course, international law. But Mario Puzo, and it makes the second volume of the movie, this, Pre-Revolutionary Cuba. There's also a brilliant book, the name of the author, it might be Rachel Kushner, called Telex from Cuba or Telex from Havana. It's a brilliant book. I often find, as you know, fiction.
Notice how the future gets mentioned casually, like this is all somehow normal now.
comment Donald Trump made it when he was still in campaign mode, inviting $1 billion worth of donations from the oil companies upon the promise that he'd give them something brilliant. And he's now giving them Venezuela. So that was point two. That's Yuval Noah Harari describing what the world was going to look like when you had rival fortresses, when the rules-based order had gone out of the window, and when there was an essentially accepted reality under which you can do whatever the hell you want if you're strong enough. No one will be cheering louder this week than Vladimir Putin and Deng Xiaoping and Xi, the Chinese leader, because they are being told that their tactics, whether it is in Ukraine actually or Taiwan potentially, their tactics are not only going to be given a green light or going to be ignored by the US, but the US is now pursuing identical policy positions. So that's the world that we inhabit.
This is where money stops whispering and starts deciding.
You've got a chap called Juan Orlando Hernandez, a former president of Honduras. He was, until very recently, just getting stuck into a 45-year sentence for cocaine trafficking. So you're going to hear the phrase narco-terrorism a lot. You're going to hear the idea that that Maduro, the deposed Venezuelan president, was involved in the drug trade. Probably true, irrelevant to the importance of international law. But you're going to hear that a lot as a rationale from the idiots, as we're going to be calling them all year, from the idiots, from the Trump apologists, from the fascist-adjacent commentators. They're going to be pretending that this is all... In fact, one guy in the Mail, Richard Littlejohn in the Daily Mail, tries to compare this to the people smuggling gangs crossing the English Channel. You write an entire page without mentioning the former president of Honduras, who was serving a 45-year sentence for cocaine trafficking, until Donald Trump pardoned him. Imagine writing an entire page of words about your fever dream, your weird fetishistic fantasy that Donald Trump is such a tough guy that he is going to whip everybody into shape because he's doing it for the right reasons. He's doing it for moral reasons. He's clamping down on drug traffickers. Imagine writing that for your readers, all 11 of them, without mentioning that he gave a pardon to a former president of Honduras who was literally convicted in a literal American court of cocaine trafficking, received a 45-year sentence. So it doesn't matter how far you bend backwards, it doesn't matter how Gordian the knot is that you tie yourself into, you cannot possibly justify on any imaginable level what Donald Trump has done in Venezuela if you acknowledge the existence of Juan Orlando Hernandez. You just can't do it. You can't even begin to pretend that you're not completely corrupt, dishonest, intellectually bankrupt if you acknowledge his existence. So the only way you can do this...
This single name destroys the entire moral defense. That's why they pretend it doesn't exist.
And what was likely to follow. We're going back to 2019 when Fiona Hill, former US ambassador to Ukraine, testified to Congress that Russia was signalling very strongly that they wanted to somehow make some very strange swap agreement between Venezuela and Ukraine. In other words, the US could have Venezuela if we let Russia have Ukraine. The suggestion being that the price for letting the US go after Venezuela without any protest was and will be Ukraine. It was also suggested that Taiwan may already be on the table as a bargaining chip with China in order to secure its acquiescence to further US regional hegemony in the Americas. So
this wasn't accidental. This was warned about years ago.
That's why Nigel Farage is the other contender for stupidest observer of the week, him claiming that this will somehow upset the leaders of China and Russia. Donald Trump behaving just like the leaders of China and Russia will really put the heebie-jeebies on the leaders of China and Russia, says the daftest man in British politics. So I'll leave you to decide who is stupidest. The Daily Mail columnist writing paeans of praise to Donald Trump without mentioning the existence of the actual cocaine trafficker he pardoned just months into a 45-year sentence, or the politician claiming that Donald Trump is going to scare men like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping by behaving exactly like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping.
When your logic collapses, mockery is all you've got left.
It's 2025. The President of the United States of America is openly coveting sovereign European territory and minded to deploy precisely the same illegal tactics to annex it that he has just done in Venezuela. You've got Daily Mail columnists so bent morally, intellectually, I don't know, what other ways that they're trying to defend it. You've got UK politicians like Nigel Farage almost trying to praise it. You've got a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom who is too terrified of the consequences to criticise it or even to describe it accurately.
Listen to how insane this sounds and how calmly it's being discussed.
There's no debate about what I've just described, by the way. There's no, what do you think of the invasion? Are you in favour or against international law? That's cowardice. That's the conversation of quislings. That's like talking about Hitler going into Sudetenland, or talking about whether who was right, Neville Chamberlain or Winston Churchill. That's madness. That's the way of cowards and traitors. Trump is disgusting. Trump is now doing on the world stage what you would expect the worst kind of corrupt dictator to do. And he's doing it in plain sight. He's doing it in full knowledge that some of the people that cheered him into the White House are so invested that they can never climb down from the ludicrous positions they've adopted. The job of the rest of us is to respond to that reality, not to question whether it's real or not, but to respond to that reality. And the job of Keir Starmer is to do it soon and to do it well.
This is where pretending ends. An illegal invasion happened. A president was removed. And suddenly, the people who screamed about law and order forgot what those words meant. The most revealing moment wasn't Venezuela itself, it was the silence around Juan Orlando Hernandez, a convicted drug trafficker. A 45-year sentence. A presidential pardon. That one fact collapses every defense. This isn't strength. It's corruption wearing a tough guy costume. And the real damage isn't done by the man in power alone. It's done by the people who refuse to admit what they're watching. So here's the real question. How much law-breaking does it take before loyalty finally breaks? If you want cuts that leave excuses behind, hit like, subscribe, and stay sharp.